All right, gang. So today we're going to talk about how colonists responded, or the colonies responded to European imperialism. And there are three basic ways that we're going to talk about this, and there are three basic types of responses that we're going to go over. Okay, so the first response that we're going to discuss is actual armed conflict. Now, we obviously know that the colonists in the New World in America rose up and actually had armed conflict. We actually know that the Latin Americans often had armed conflict to overthrow theirs. But what were some other ways that colonists revolted? Well, in China, there were two sets of armed conflicts. Okay, the first one was called the Opium Wars. Well, under the Qing dynasty in China, if you'll remember, they wanted to try to keep out all European or all outside influences. The Qing and Mings really felt, hey, we don't need Europeans and we don't need to trade anything with them. Well, what began happening as Britain really wanted to trade with China, what they began doing is they began shipping in illegal shipments of opium. Now, opium is a drug. Opium is a drug that can be smoked. Opium is a drug that is where heroin comes from. What it does is opium essentially acts as a really bad painkiller. And if you smoke opium or if you ingest opium of some sort, you basically become super lazy and you don't want to do anything. Well, what was happening was the British were importing illegally opium into China. Now, China had established trading posts for Europeans, but the Europeans wanted more. They wanted more from China. They wanted more influence. And so when Britain began inputting this in, Britain said, or the Chinese said no, and they actually went to war against it. Well, that didn't work out so well for the Chinese because they simply did not have the technology and the arms that the British did. And so the British ended up defeating them, not once, but twice in wars over opium. And the end result of this was that China was forced to allow Britain to trade and forced to allow basically to give Britain 5 cities in which they can trade. And that also, the Opium Wars also wound up being what gave Britain Hong Kong and control over the city of Hong Kong, which China just got back in 1999. Okay, well, the second armed conflict in China occurred in 1900 in something called the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers were a religious group, and they said they wanted to box out foreign influence from China. They had seen all of these negative things that were coming into China, or what they felt were negative things coming into China, and they wanted to expel them. Now, the Chinese not only wanted to expel European influence, but the Boxer Rebellion also was against Japanese influence, which was beginning to have a lot of influence in China. The Japanese, as we'll talk about in just a second, were beginning their own age of imperialism and expansion, and they wanted to kick out the Japanese as well. So two armed conflicts in China, the Opium Wars in the mid-1800s and the Boxer Rebellion in the, around the year 1900. Well, in India, there was an armed conflict as well, and this actually led to some self-rule or some more independent rule for the Indians. The Sepoy Rebellion was a rebellion in India in which the Sepoys rebelled against the British Empire. Sepoys were native troops that the British used to put down rebellions. So basically, the Sepoys were Hindus and they were Muslims who fought for Britain. Okay, and they were almost like a militia. They were not really a police force, but they were groups that put down conflict and expanded the British Empire in India. Well, the Sepoys, being Muslim and Hindu, were vegetarians. Well, Hindus were vegetarians, but the Muslims didn't eat pork. Well, here's why they revolted. The British began packing their rifles and their bullets with pork fat. The way the old rifles work is you had to pack the gunpowder in, and in order to keep the gunpowder dry, they put a fatty seal on it. Well, that fatty seal was made of pork fat. And in order to fire your rifle, you had to bite it off with your mouth. And so basically, Muslims were being forced to eat pork, or at least put it in their mouth, and that violated their religion. And so the Sepoys revolted against the British in 1857. Now, while it was not successful, it did begin Britain allowing much more self-rule for the Indians. So another response to European or American imperialism was imitation. Well, in the mid-1800s, America sent a commodore or a fleet to Japan. And America now at this point is just beginning to really get into the world scene in the mid-1800s. So in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry from the United States goes to Japan in 1853, and he sits outside Tokyo and says, look, either you're going to open up and you're going to trade with us and possibly even other Europeans, or we're going to bomb your city. And that was the deal. So instead of being bombed, the Tokugawa shogunate was like, yeah, okay, we'll trade with you. And so Commodore Perry of the United States, opened up Japan for trade and basically forced them to trade with other countries. Now, here's how that worked out. The Tokugawa shogunate began losing power. We've talked about the Tokugawa shogunate before, and there was a fight for power. And emerging out of this was something called the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji family took control, and the Meiji family, what they did was they began to modernize Japan. The Meiji took control in the, I think, 1857, and the Meijis then began to modernize technology. They began to modernize the military, and they also began to modernize the government. It's at this point that Japan develops its first parliament system. It becomes a sort of a constitutional monarchy with people being able to vote a little bit, not a whole lot, for their government rulers. But most importantly, as we're talking about here, Japan begins to greatly imitate Europeans. They model their navy almost completely after the British. They model their government a little bit off of European models. And so what Japan does is they imitate the West. They imitate Europeans, and now they're like, hey, we're an island. We need raw materials and resources too. Let's go get some. And so they invade Korea. They take over Korea. They go into Japan. They go into China, and they take over some things from China. And they really began to grow their influence, and they really began to expand. And this expansion is actually what winds up leading, one of the things that contributes to the Second World War, rather. But they're beginning to expand. One of the important things to note here is that they also went to war in 1904 with Russia. Russia didn't like Japanese expansion because it threatened their eastern borders. And so Russia was like, it's no big deal. This is Japan. They don't mean anything. Well, Japan actually defeated Russia in the 1904 Russo-Japanese War, which leads to some bad things for Russia, as we'll talk about later, in the Russian Tsars we'll talk about later. Last but not leastly, the last response to imperialism is nationalism. Nationalism, obviously, is pride in one's country, and this is seen especially in India. And so the Indians, being that many of them are educated in British schools, taught to be proud of country, they're like, wait a minute, I'm not from Britain, but I can still be proud of my country. What they do is they go back, many of the upper elite of India come back from being educated in Britain, and they say, you know what, we need to govern ourselves. And so what this does is it begins the formation of what's called the Indian National Congress. The Indian National Congress is an Indian nationalist political party formed in 1885, whose sole purpose is to gain control of India for Hindus. Their purpose is to gain Hindu independence and create India as a country, okay, and to govern for them. Following all that, in 1906, the Muslim League was formed. Muslim League is a Muslim group who is formed to govern or create a Muslim country in India as well, or not in India, but in the Indian subcontinent that Britain rules. All right, well, that's all for today, and I'll talk to you guys later.